While everyone is enjoying what looks to be a delicious lunch, we are very fortunate to have two wonderful speakers who have come here to share some additional information with us. And I myself am very excited to hear them. I've had a chance to check them out online. I haven't had a chance to hear them myself either. So I'm very happy to introduce to you Gina Maisto-Smith and Leslie Gomez. Gina and Leslie are the owners of Pepper Hamilton, which is a national practice dedicated to the institutional response of sexual misconduct. They have spent their careers investigating and responding to sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and child abuse. Part of their job is to help colleges and universities and K through 12 schools in the development of policies, systems, and practices that are compassionate, trauma-informed, fair, and impartial, and legally compliant. So please join me in giving a round of applause as we welcome Gina and Leslie.
Good afternoon. As we begin Reflections from the Road, I'd like to note that these reflections are not just from the literal road of zigzagging across the country with colleges, universities, and K through 12 schools, but the road to equality in sexual and gender-based violence and harassment. That road was paved for Leslie and me through the course of our careers as former prosecutors, and taking the voices of victims and the voices of those who were committed to these issues long before there were rooms filled with 450 people committed to these efforts. In 1986, when I started as an intern in the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, it was not a crime to rape your wife. The law said, and many across this country said, sexual intercourse with someone not your spouse. In 1986, when I started, it was not a crime to have sexual intercourse with a person without their consent. So I've seen firsthand, from walking with thousands of victims through the domestic violence, the child abuse, the adult rape, and the homicide unit that involve these issues, what community can do, and what efforts like this. Thank you, First Lady Snyder, for bringing these voices together, because the law changed since 1986. That community changed. It is now commonplace to have advocacy and support in each and every day. So these reflections from the road come from the heart, come from walking with thousands who have experienced issues of sexual and gender-based violence and harassment in our communities. Now you say, what do former prosecutors have to offer? Why are former prosecutors of 20 years in this space? Because we had the benefit of visionaries. We had the benefit of individuals who created individual units to respond to these issues, who understood that the law enforcement system alone and the criminal justice system alone could not make a difference in the lives of those who experience sexual and gender-based crimes. So we learned very early on the benefit of trauma-informed investigations, of having an advocate from the outset, of good communication and checking in. Over the course of those 20 years, our jobs were not just conviction at all costs, but our jobs were working in those units to speak to the needs of those individuals who we serve and flipping the lens and understanding that.
We saw a tremendous need for systems and a tremendous need for education and change in our processes. When I left the DA's office in 2011 as the chief of our juvenile court unit, I saw that there were so many laws that still needed to be changed. Across the country, there are still states where you must prove force or threat of force to prove that a rape occurred. Across the country, and I loved Dr. Campbell's reference to this earlier, we have very hierarchical approaches to what sexual assault and rape looks like. that we still use the term non-stranger sexual assault as if it is different or less than or not as significant or traumatic as an assault by someone that I don't know. And yet we know from the daily experiences for our combined 40 years of those individuals, one after the other, the impact, no matter who the offender was, and in some cases, a more significant impact because of who the offender was, in our sense of self, our sense of belief, and our sense of trust. And if we knew the barriers that were in place to coming forward, the young women who said, I don't want to be that girl, the young men who said, no one will believe me, they'll think that I'm gay. The older folks who we spoke to came out for the first times in their life at the age of 20 or 30 or 40 and talked about child sexual abuse and talked about, I thought I was the only one or there was something wrong with me. If we could take what we knew in that space about the barriers that we as a society were putting in place and to help institutions learn from that process, to teach trauma-informed approaches, to teach how we can holistically and compassionately respond, both in prevention and in investigation and response, then we had some ability or hope to change the conversation and change the culture. So what I hope that you'll hear from us in our short time together, and I recognize that it is short, we're going to give you some very high-level concepts, and we won't be able to dig particularly deep on any of them. But what I hope that you'll hear is an approach that's about compassionate compliance, not about compliance for the sake of technical attributes of the law, because that's not who we are in this space.
As we go to these slides, I want to frame our conversation with two concepts that I ask you to take with you as you add your voices to what we are hoping is a harmonious path forward, is a harmonious road forward, not just the cacophony of voices that we're hearing now across the country, and that's imperative to make a difference, but to bring harmony. Two concepts I'd like to start you with. One is we don't know what we don't know about someone's experience in the space of interpersonal violence. And if we start with that frame, we become fertile ground and open to use trauma-informed systems and trauma-informed behavior. The moment we think we know it all, we've seen it all, we've heard it, we've got that one pegged, and that's where we're going, is the moment we fail to serve. So, number one concept, as all of you leave here, we don't know what we don't know, and we want to be fertile ground to be open to hearing each and every account. Second, together we are better than the sum of our parts. Every single issue that you have seen emerge across this country in the media is directly connected to the impact of a siloed environment. Good intentions abound, but quantitative good intentions don't add up to qualitative, effective, informed responses. So together we are better than the sum of our parts. We don't know what we don't know, and together we're better than the sum of our parts. If you leave with that, we have left you with something to go forth and create a new pathway.
Futures with Violence outlined for you the beginning of this national movement that started with Angie Epifano at Amherst. And I echo your remarks. If you've not read that letter, go back and find it from October of 2012. The courage and the activism of complainants, victims, survivors, and I use all three words because language is individual and we can each choose to self-identify the term that works for us, that meets our experience where we are at the moment. But the courage of those individuals has moved the needle on this conversation further than those of us professionals in this room, professionals on this stage have been able to do in the past 20 years. And to imagine the paradigm shift that's occurring is incredibly remarkable when you look at the nature of public institutional failures that we've seen. Look no farther than November of 2011 at a Pennsylvania institution that showed us very stark examples of what can happen when you confuse institutional reputation with institutional integrity. And think about all of the very proactive responses that we've seen since then and the way in which social media and this national platform has changed the conversation in significant ways. And I will share that for those of us in educational institutions, it is sometimes uncomfortable. It is sometimes a difficult conversation. It is sometimes one that leaves us defensive and thinking, What did we do wrong? Are we right? Those facts aren't exactly how I would have portrayed the facts, but make no mistake about it. Student activists are not our enemies. And what we need to understand is to flip the lens, the phrase that Gina used, to understand the perspective of the students that we serve, of the faculty that we serve, of the employees that we serve. Because if the perception is that we have failed them, that in some significant and critical way, we have failed them. And to be able to listen to that feedback and that content and to embrace it as we think about improving and enhancing our responses means that we will be able to continue to change culture and climate in this significant space.
In moving that conversation forward, governments are important. Leadership is important. The tone at the top is important to start to shift and change culture. Your voice here today, First Lady Snyder, with the governor, is important. That says to folks around this great state, it's okay to have these open conversations. It's okay to embrace the tension of what's uncomfortable, because that's how we break through. But we've seen over the last several years, and particularly since 2011, lots of laws addressing this issue. And Leslie said a minute ago, we couldn't move the needle for 10 or 20 of years with thousands of victims, one at a time, just slogging through it and wishing it had this type of energy and wishing it had this type of traction and support. So what has happened since 2011 is the federal government paying attention, the federal government listening. I have never seen issues on the table of survivors and those who go through these cases on campuses reach the White House, reach federal legislation so quickly. And I know many have toiled for years to put those pieces in place, but what we're seeing across the country is not only federal action, hearing and interpreting and making laws to address these issues, but also we see state action. And we call upon you in individual states to be more creative and to think what state action and what on the ground grassroots efforts we can do in our individual communities. But make no mistake about it, the legislature, the executive branch, and the judicial branch is getting in the mix, and this is contributing to what feels like a cacophony of disharmonious voices, but it is setting the stage by embracing the tension and paying close attention to the issues, the laws, and then how we take and implement those issues and laws.
It's bumpy, right? We're changing the wheels of the bus while the bus is in motion. And it's not a smooth process. It's not a seamless process. We're one step forward, two steps back. Sometimes we get it right, sometimes we don't. But as long as we take the chance to learn from what we've done and to recognize that every interaction that we have with a student, with an employee, with a community member is the chance to get that interaction right, we're going to continue on a positive growth. This is an old quote from the 2001 Revised Sexual Harassment Guidance, and those of you who are deeply into campus responses will know this document inside and out. But it references the very key concept that doing nothing is always the wrong response, that there may be many right ways to respond. And if we think about the lesson that we all learned so well from Becky Campbell, understanding the different ways in which survivors can experience some of the HPA excess adrenal gland effects. Did I get that right? If we think about that space and understand it, what we're going to recognize is that every individual that we encounter will have an experience that is unique as a fingerprint, and that it may change on a daily basis as we process through trauma. And if we think about that space, what it tells us is that there's more than one right way to respond to each individual and at different times. But what's most important is that as we respond, that we treat it with the same reasonable, common sense judgment that we bring to every other issue in higher education, in the care and attention that we bring to our profession every day in every way.
Language in this space is vital, and listening to student voices is vital. We learned from students at a school on the West Coast the concept of first draft. We usually start with this because we all make mistakes with language. We all put our foot in it, and we are not immune from that. We ask in this audience, as we move through, you apply the concept of first draft to us and to each other. That's the beginning of creating safe space and respectful space for these conversations, knowing that we're working toward a common goal, but we may not have the language or experience to get us there. Let me give you one example in the language space. How many of you have used the phrase, he said, she said? Let me see, I can't see hands. Yes, we all have, especially in law enforcement. I would work on a case and the officer would say, that's just a he said, she said. What does he said, she said connote, though, to the listener? Remember, flipping the lens. He said, she said connotes heteronormativity, that we think it only happens with he's and she's, and it does not. Inclusivity is a core concept in doing this work well. He said, she said suggests, we can't figure it out. Flip a coin. There are ways to figure it out. Good forensic, trauma-informed interviews, understanding peripheral information, understanding how to use the digital world, understanding other interviews of individuals in the context of each case. There are lots of ways that prosecutors do this. There are lots of ways that Title IX investigators in the sexual and gender-based harassment space figure it out. It is not flip a coin. There are ways to evaluate events like this. And more importantly, what we heard from one survivor, when the officer said, it's just a he said, she said, it made me feel like I wasn't valued, and the he was elevated over the she. So that's just one example of the myriad examples that exist in the sensitive space of language where we have to be precise. And if we're in the business of inclusion, and if we're in the business of removing sexual and gender-based harassment and violence, we need to be committed to language and understand that fingerprint in each and every one of these cases.
So practically speaking, what does first draft mean? It means that I respect that you're sitting across from me and you're trying to communicate a difficult concept. You might not have the right words. You might not get it right the first time. But rather than knee-jerk reaction to, I don't understand what you're saying, or you must mean this, let's take a moment to really understand the person across the table, whether it's in an interview of a complainant, victim, survivor, witness, whether it's in a multidisciplinary team setting where student affairs are trying to figure out how to work with law enforcement or trying to figure out how to work with faculty. As we think about what our shared goals are, and I think that we can all agree, and our shared goal is to protect the safety of victims and to promote accountability for behavior that is outside the confines of our policy and in many instances outside the confines of law. That our shared goal is to create college campuses and ultimately a society more broadly that's free from discrimination and harassment and gender and sex-based violence. If we can get there and keep our eye on that goal and do that through first draft, to embrace the tension and create the safe space for conversation, we have tremendous capacity. I remember when the Jerry Sandusky piece came out, and all of the 13-year-old boys in our school were running around making great Sandusky jokes. Now, humor is one defense mechanism many of us use. But it was an opportunity to engage, to say to those 13-year-old boys, well, do you know what this means? Let's talk about the impacts of this. And that issue, the Angie Epifano coming forward, the student activism across the country, the first person accounts. When I was a young prosecutor, we read in the paper every day about the gunpoint robberies, the burglaries, the homicides that occurred. We never read about the assault that happened to a child or that happened within a home, because the victims were silent and they were invisible in that space. And for good reason, to respect privacy. But what it meant was that we couldn't touch and quantify and hold and embrace those accounts. And so this courageousness of those who've come forward to say, this is who I am. Look at me. I'm 5'5". I've got long curly hair. I'm a little on the overweight side. It's not freshman 15 anymore. It's many years after that. But here's where I stand, and this is what happened to me, to share that experience. Makes it different and makes it real and gives some power to what we're talking about to be able to shift these conversations in significant ways. And as we're doing that, to embrace the tension that we're not all going to agree on exactly how to get there, on how quickly to get there, and knowing that when I put one piece in a process that might remove a barrier for some, it may add a barrier for others. That there is not one solution that uniformly and holistically addresses all.
But it is a process. And to think about it holistically, I like to think about it as the mind of this issue, the body of this issue, and the spirit of this issue. So effective practices incorporate owning and understanding the regulatory framework. And that is no simple task. But we are charged as colleges and universities across the country to do that. And don't forget, it's not a dirty word, compliance. Laws are not a dirty word, but in fact, especially in recent years, they are designed and promulgated to bring to life the experiences of individuals. And that's what we're seeing in some of the laws. But we need to own the complex regulatory framework as the mind of this. But most importantly, we need to understand the body of this. We need to understand the Emmas and the Laurens and the respondents that go through these processes as well to understand how these cases, how our systems impact individuals. Make no mistake about it, fair and impartial process is for all, and fair and impartial process helps survivors ultimately. Because if we have bad process, and if we have uninformed process, we have bad outcomes for survivors. Or if we have bad process and uninformed process, we continue the legal battle for survivors beyond our campus processes. So understanding the dynamics of trauma and understanding how these cases impact people must be integrated with the regulatory framework. And that takes us to the third element,
which is an institution's unique policies and procedures. We have the great privilege to work with a number of institutions in Michigan. Each and every one of them are different in size, in scope, in resources, in makeup, in personnel, in policies and procedures. There is no one uniform response. And I really loved hearing from Futures of Violence about thinking about best practices or effective practices or promising practices. But we're really talking about developing standards of care so that no matter whether I'm a small community college or a large state institution with multiple campuses, I have some framework and some guidelines on when those standards might be. We're not there yet, but we're getting there in terms of developing them.
So here is an easy way to think about mastering the regulatory framework.
Oh, I'm so glad you laughed. I thought you all were asleep over your meals.
With all kidding aside, this is, where's Rebecca? Are you in the room? This is what the Post-it notes in my head are doing, and I have time to think about this. But when an incident comes in, and you don't need to read what each box says, but when an incident comes in, that's that big orange box, and those light blue boxes are a representation of us understanding that incidents can come in from many places. Each person's response and where they go after an event is different. So we may learn of things in many places in the institution. We want to make sure, though, wherever a case comes in, that it gets into a coordinated, centralized, informed process. Remember, informed by the law, but informed by trauma-informed practices and informed by our community and our community values and policies. So that big blue box just to the right of center represents a centralized process. But if you look at the red boxes below, that represents many of the laws that inform this space. That's not all of them, but that's many of them. So we hear Title IX, Title IX, Title IX, Title IX. One time I said to an audience, Title IX was like Marcia of the Brady Bunch. Marcia, Marcia, Marcia. Everything's Marcia, but there are lots of other laws in the family. And I knew I was not knowing my audience because a student raised their hand and said, who's Marcia? So I understood better to read my audience. But Title IX is just one of those laws. There is VAWA. There is Clery. There is 504 disability. There are other titles that inform our movement. There are state laws. There are state confidentiality laws. There are state law enforcement provisions that must be considered. So our work on colleges and university campuses is to own the regulatory framework and to be sure when we pull it together, it is seamless and trauma-informed, that this is just one element. The other thing that this slide represents is other things that can be going on at the same time as one of these cases on our campus. So while the red and blue track represent the university track, the green and gray represent a law enforcement track, which could be going on in parallel based on the choice of a complainant survivor or based on the evidence that exists where law enforcement can take a case on independent evidence. We look all the way to the right to the yellow boxes. That represents that maybe one of our community members is a criminal defendant and how we need to think about those processes and how they intersect. And all the way to the right of the slide, the light green boxes represent the ability to have regulatory oversight by OCR or civil cases filed by either a complainant or a respondent. And if you look to the far right, we may have media. And we may have media asking questions about how we do what we do. So from an institutional standpoint, we must own and navigate and give voice to these processes and think now, not in the middle of a crisis, but think now how these processes intersect. Think now how we best serve community members by flipping the lens and putting into place not only what the law requires, but what our community members need.
We also have to think about the difference between the musts, the shoulds, and the may. So I'll pull out Title IX just as an example. Title IX is a statute. It's very short in length. And then we have implementing regulations that give us a little bit more detail, but not significant understanding about what we need to do on a campus. Then we step into documents like the 2001 Revised Sexual Harassment Guidance, and more recently, the April 2011 Dear Colleague Letter and the April 2014 Questions and Answers on Title IX and Sexual Violence. Those documents, we've been told, are significant guidance documents. And then we've got things like the White House Task Force, which is tremendously helpful information. We don't necessarily know where it comes from, and we call that advisory-ish. It's not law. It doesn't have the force of law. It doesn't even have the force of significant guidance. And yet, if you go to the resources section on notalone.gov, you can see sample policy language, role of the Title IX coordinator, sample definitions, this new concept of interim and support measures, right? Where do they come from? We actually asked OCR that question last week, and they didn't really know where they came from. But we are all out there trying to think about this cacophony of information, and which do we have to follow? Which can we choose to follow based on our values? And it's a really complicated analysis to know that here I say we have to have a prompt and equitable grievance procedure, but to know what does that mean? Is it an investigative model? Is it a model with a hearing? We have a case right now in Michigan that's moving forward at the district court level about what a hearing means and what campus processes need to look like. And so understanding how all of those things impact, if we go back to that earlier slide, legislative action, executive branch action, and judicial action, we are at the crosshairs of judicial action and executive branch action and legislative action, and understanding how we, in the middle of that, have to navigate and stay true north, which is student welfare, protecting victims, and promoting accountability for behavior that violates our norms on campus, our laws, and society.
It's worthy to pause a moment on the question, and many in our community members, and I would imagine that this audience doesn't ask the question anymore, but I give you language on this question to go out and talk to others who are less informed. And that question is, why aren't cases that are otherwise crimes going to law enforcement? At a high level, if you talk to survivors across the country, and many who have toiled in this space on college and university campuses, they will say, because law enforcement has not taken these cases, because they won't take that word against word credibility case. They won't take that case without physical evidence. Many jurisdictions across the country do not. There are some that do, and we happen to be a beneficiary of that in Philadelphia. Whether we took a case did not depend on physical evidence. It depended on the undercurrent, the believability of the evidence, the availability, and the willingness of the survivor to proceed in Philadelphia. So what about these cases make it difficult for colleges and universities? They're word against word credibility cases, and I ask you to take all the he said, she saids in your brain and delete it and replace all with word against word credibility case. Never will we say it's a he said, she said. So with me, one time, word, thank you. And in word against word credibility cases,
make no mistake about it, the word of a complainant, victim, survivor alone is sufficient.
In the criminal context, many jury instructions recognize that. They say the word alone of a complainant victim in a case is sufficient to convict if believed beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard of proof. And so those word against word credibility cases create conundrums for us in the college and university context. Why? Because there is no physical evidence, because there's no aha moment, there's no picture, there's no videotape, there's no photograph often to prove these cases. And in 100% of these cases, at least 50% of your constituencies as the college and university provider is going to be unhappy with the result. And when they're unhappy with the result,
they no longer point the finger at one another. They point the finger where? At you, at the process. And at a process that is baked in perception of institutional bias, conflict of role, because of where we sit, who we are, the requirement that we be all things to all people, that we be a system of belief and care and support and interim measures, that we be a system of proof and careful, impartial investigation, that we be a system of adjudication and after-the-fact response, And as we navigate all of those roles, particularly in a small school, we sometimes put them all in a small number of people. And for a complainant, when I sit with you and you help me call my mother, and then the next day you ask me about text messages, the rug is pulled out from me and you've punched me in the gut at the same time. And for a respondent, when you have already decided helping the complainant through all of those incredibly important places to get somebody to stable footing, to help them navigate, to help them engage with process. And I've now suspended someone interim. And then I come back and say, okay, now tell me what you'd like to share with me. It doesn't feel fair. And so how do we deconflict the system? How do we pull out from it that perception of institutional bias? Because we hear compelling narratives of institutional betrayal. We heard one this morning that was so powerful, that every one of us walked away saying, who is that school? What happened? Wanting to know more about that. That's the system that we're working within.
In the law enforcement system, before we pass the slide, I just want to point out that law enforcement has the time and the toolkit. So often in investigations, we will see a school ask for more information or ask for text messages or ask for things like physical evidence, and they can't get it. They don't have subpoena power. They don't have search warrant power. And to the extent that there are criminal behaviors, how do we bridge that gap in getting the right information to best serve survivors and to best hold individuals who commit these crimes that are also civil rights violations accountable? And that's where I want your juices to start flowing here today. These are the conversations I want you to be having, to be thinking about solutions and not just complaining about the problem, but thinking about how we partner with external law enforcement in a way that is trauma-informed and centered on the goal, again, of supporting survivors and holding offenders accountable.
So the answer to why we don't just call law enforcement is that we have an independent obligation under Title IX to investigate, separate apart from anything that happens in law enforcement. In this space, police investigations can be useful, and they have a greater toolkit, and frankly, they have a greater ability to punish and incarcerate and prevent. We have a different standard, and much of what we look at in the harassment arena may not even hit criminal standards. So critically important that we keep the space here. And finally, understanding VAWA and the impact of VAWA, which is elevating complainant, victim, survivor, agency, and autonomy, and their right as an adult to choose whether or not to notify law enforcement or to decline to notify law enforcement, and how we balance that on a campus context with our broader obligation to campus safety and the welfare of all of our students. And this, I suggest, is the space where schools are struggling with the greatest in terms of how to navigate the push and the pull between wanting to help someone, but in helping that person individually, we may lose the opportunity to help the campus more broadly. OCR has recognized the pull here, and we just throw these slides for you very briefly. First, obtain consent. Students' interest in confidentiality is the phrase they use. They really mean anonymity or decision not to proceed with an investigation or not to pursue disciplinary action. Strongly support that interest. However, there are circumstances in which we must override that request. But when we do override that request, it can have a chilling effect. So it is a tightrope walk, not just for the victim, survivor, complainant, but also for us as an institution, and meeting that person where they are at the moment, knowing that that will change over time, and hopefully change in a positive way as we take advantage of each and every opportunity to improve that trajectory of healing by having positive interactions that help and not hurt.
So flipping the lens, it's not just the institutional process that's complicated, but when you think about what our laws and guidance tell us we need to share with a complainant survivor after one of these events, we have to give them all of their options in writing. Right to call law enforcement, right to decline to go to law enforcement, the importance of preservation of evidence, the availability of accommodations, the confidential resources, the private resources, and what the difference between the two is, what happens with information. My head is spinning, and I'm not a trauma survivor standing here on the stage. So these are the things that we are facing our complainant survivors with in the aftermath of these cases. And when I listen to what Rebecca shared with us earlier, that 96-hour time frame, these are issues and questions and options that are being raised immediately after an event when someone comes forward or when they decide to disclose and come forward. So we need to always be flipping the lens and understand from the perspective of the survivor what they are going through, and how do we best communicate these options in a clear and transparent way.
When that world gets smaller because of the incident, it's our job to help open it up again, to help that student access every educational opportunity on our campus. And candidly, we're doing that for a respondent also, unless and until we have made the decision that they are responsible for the conduct and should be removed from our community. So we, of course, leave 3 minutes left to talk about effective campus responses. We tend to spend more time in the challenges than we do in the solutions, but we're going to run them through for you.
So primarily with effective responses, we need to be thinking seamlessly, we need to be thinking coordinated, we need to be thinking plain English, transparency, and the only way we get to that is by working collaboratively as a community. The only way we get to that is listening with an earnest intent to hear the experiences of those we serve. That's the foundation.
This is what it might look like on your campus. Oh, I'm clicking the computer like that's going to help. This is what it might look like on your campus, that we know all of the blue boxes across the top. This is the simplified context that Gina showed you earlier. Anybody who might possibly receive a report or become aware of information they knew or should have known. We've got that smaller subset, the little red oval, confidential resources, so that you know, student or employee, where to go and how your information will be used based on where you share it. When we get it to one of our reporting options across campus, whether it be all responsible employees, some responsible employees on campus, it comes central every single time to a coordinated, educated, experienced, dedicated, multidisciplinary team that can look to putting all of the right supports in place, balanced and appropriate for a complainant and a respondent if we decide to notify them as part of the process, and can look to what you can't quite read in that orange box, but that's the coordination of all of our Title IX clear VAWA responsibilities, timely warning, daily crime log, pulling it all together, and then showing there are 2 tracks. Yes, I want to go forward with this investigation and that might lead to disciplinary action, or no, I want something different and I don't quite know what that is yet, but what are the ways that we can provide remedial measures and supports and targeted training and education? And under both tracks, we're taking every action we can to eliminate, prevent, and address discrimination, harassment, or a hostile environment.
So what you are good at in the college and university space, and what students are good at, and what advocates are good at, is creating a rich and robust ecosystem of care and support. And that phrase is not original. That came from?
That phrase is from President Luana Simon, Michigan State University. Her identification of what we need to do as college campuses. An ecosystem, and I went back to Wikipedia and Webster to look it up, ecosystem really is a community of living organisms and non-living organisms. And how do we pull together our policies, our practices, our education with the individuals? We had a president who once shared with us, I thought if I had the perfect alchemy of policy, that I'd be inoculated from these issues. He said, and what I realized was that I'd far rather have mediocre policy and first-rate consistent implementation. I'd far rather have good care and concern and skill set in the people that are interacting with our students on a daily basis. And we'll get the policy there along the way. And that lens was so critical to understand the importance of implementation, that words on a paper will get us nowhere. Even our best efforts as an institution will get us nowhere without the support, the buy-in, the contribution, and the engagement of our students on campus to change and shift culture in this space.
Given the expectations of fair and impartial process and the expectations of trauma-informed investigations and support, we recognize being practitioners handling thousands of cases for years, 30 a day, 150 a week, over 20 years, you do the math, tens of thousands of hours. It's fluent for us. It's not as fluent for those in the university setting that do 1 or 2 or sometimes up to 10 a year. So I want you to think about creative solutions. What some schools are doing is they're putting their investigations outside. Not sure how that's going to work out, but external investigators that are trained and informed solve one problem, but may create another. So I am challenging this state and the leadership of this state to think about creative solutions outside of what we're doing. Out of the box. Corey, where are you? I loved your think out of the box. Let's push this out of the box with the many leaders in this room. Let's think about a regional center to do independent investigation, care, trauma-informed, supportive, and fair and impartial investigations and adjudications, with the result going back to the institution. We'd rather, I think, in the institutional setting, spend our resources on funding an independent, informed regional center that has advocacy, support, medical care, choices, and a safe space, rather than carrying the burden on the institutional level the way we're doing right now. So I encourage you to think about that. I encourage you to think about the benefits of that in the context of word against word cases. And I encourage you, on the last slide, to think about the concepts that we shared with you today, starting with, together we're better than the sum of our parts, and we don't know what we don't know.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short 5-minute break and reconvene at 1 o'clock.